Drawing with perspective means reproduce a scenario or a subject similar to how we see it with our eyes. This can be done with precise geometrical techniques or with approximate, just estimated drawings. What are the characteristics of a perspective image? First of all, what is near is big and what is far is small. We can clearly see that the balloon in the foreground is much bigger than those in the background. If we have objects with the same size in a perspective drawing, we need to adapt their size to the depth in the field. The more distant they are, the smaller they become. A second important characteristic is the vanishing point. If we have objects that are aligned along parallel lines, we can see how those objects converge to an imaginary point in the picture. This point is called vanishing point. The rails are actually straight, but in our vision of the world, considering that what is far seems smaller, the rails look like they would touch themselves in the vanishing point. We can see it here as well. All the horizontal planks converge to a vanishing point in the left of the photograph. Another important characteristic is that the vanishing point is mostly located on the horizon. The horizon is the farthest point that we can see. This is why everything converges in the horizon. Also for this reason, the horizon is usually considered equal to our eye level. This means that we look up to whatever is over the horizon line and look down to whatever is under the horizon line. You can see that in this photograph we can look down on the roofs of the buildings that are under the horizon line, while in this perspective the horizon line is somewhere here and we can't see the roofs of the buildings. If I would draw something like this scenario, I would need to use the horizon line to decide on what I look down and on what I look up. I draw this very simplified, but the concept is good visible. The perspective would be wrong if I would draw something like this, where I look down on every element. A lot of artists used to build up the perspective with straight lines and geometrical calculations. I personally draw more with my instinct. Sometimes the perspective might not be so perfect, but if I feel that it is not bothering me, I don't care too much about it. But of course, even if I don't like to measure every detail, sometimes I have to build a scheme that helps me to do the perspective in the right way. If you want to build up your perspective, there are different ways to do that. Let's say that we want to draw a cube. Notice that a cube is composed by lines or edges that go in 3 directions. This is a cube in an orthogonal drawing, what means there is no perspective. The lines are parallel, there is no vanishing point. The first type of perspective that we can use is with one vanishing point. In this type of perspective, the lines of our cube are converging to the same vanishing point. All horizontal lines and all vertical lines are still straight because the front of the cube is facing directly towards us. Just the lines of one direction are going to a vanishing point. The second type of perspective is with 2 vanishing points. We can use this kind of construction if we want to draw the cube from a different angle. Now just the vertical lines are still straight, while the horizontal lines all go in depth using one vanishing point for each direction. Sometimes drawing a subject from this angle is more interesting than from the front. The third and last way to draw a cube in perspective is using 3 vanishing points. Now all lines of all 3 directions follow their own vanishing points. There are no more parallel lines in our cube. This perspective is usually used to draw huge buildings like skyscraper because it gives the impression of something big. It is usually not used to draw small objects. If you draw an object with more than 3 directions, you can use more vanishing points, but sometimes it is easier to bring down the directions to 3. You can build up your object in a cube or a composition that use the 3 axes to find all points to connect in order to create new directions without new vanishing points. Let's draw, for instance, a simple house. I do this directly in Photoshop, but it is not different than to draw it on paper. I use the red color to build up the perspective, just to understand to what the different lines belong and to not getting confused between perspective composition and the lines of the actual drawing of the house. Let's use 2 vanishing points. This means that every line that stands for an horizontal element of the house flows into a vanishing point, while the vertical elements are still drawn with vertical lines. The amount of details is not very high, but you can do it much more detailed if you like to experiment around with perspective drawings. The walls and all the little elements of the base of the house can be drawn by just connecting the lines to the vanishing points, because they are perpendicular to each other. The roof, instead, is built up in a rectangle, from which I find the middle point and connect it then with the base. In this way, I find the right inclination. It might look a bit complex, but it is actually very easy and fun. All you have to do is connect your already existing points in the drawing to the vanishing points. As soon as you get used to it, it becomes really intuitive. I recommend you to just jump in and experiment. You might have a lot of questions at the beginning, but perspective drawing is really just logical thinking. Don't be afraid, it is really easier than it looks from the outside. The color theory can be very complex, but the basics are really simple. The colors are divided in different categories. Since centuries, for the traditional painters, 3 were the primary colors: red, blue, and yellow. These are called primary colors because they can be mixed together in order to create other colors. Mixing red and yellow, we obtain orange. Red and blue gives purple, while blue and yellow make green. These 3 colors that we obtain mixing primary colors together, orange, purple, and green, are called secondary colors. Mixing primary and secondary colors together, we can create tertiary colors. Black and white are called neutral colors. According to physics, the human eye can see the colors because of the light that bounces off the object and reaches the eye, and considers white as the union of all colors, while black is considered the absence of colors. The mixing of pigments works a bit different, but white is used to make every color brighter, and black is used to make every color darker. Usually, a painter can create every painting with just 5 colors: red, blue, yellow, black, and white. Complementary colors are those which create the strongest contrast when placed near to each other. A sort of opposite colors. The complementary color of red is green, the one of blue is orange, and the one of yellow is purple. Colors can also be divided in warm colors and cool colors. Choosing the right colors for an illustration is important because the colors can support or reduce the feelings that an artist wants to give to the viewer. This is why a lot of illustrations, movies, and photos use specific color filters, creating specific effects. It is also interesting to notice that in professional photography, there is always a balance between the colors. The color palette often includes all different tones and shadings of one or few predominant colors, and often use a few details or little elements with a high contrasting color. Artists who study the colors are looking for the right balance between them. They study the relationship between colors, trying to use colors that work very well together and that support each other and their element according to the message that the artist wants to give to the viewer. Remember also that the use of colors in contrast attract much more attention, so they can be used to drag the eye of the viewer directly to the focal point of the image or to the main subject. The same happens with the saturation. Highly saturated and vibrating colors attract much more attention than less saturated colors. Another important aspect to study is the changing of value and saturation to explain distance and dimensions of the objects. This happens especially in landscapes, where we can see far away and observe large elements like hills and mountains. This phenomenon is called atmospheric perspective. We can see that the hills in the background are much less saturated, and their color is getting closer and closer to that of the sky. We can also notice that the shadows in the foreground usually are much darker than those in the background. Choosing the right colors does not only mean to choose between green or blue, for example, but means choosing also the right saturation and the value to explain your image in the best way and give it its full potential. Every color in your illustration is like an instrument in an orchestra. To work in the best way along with the other instruments and to create the best symphony as a whole big piece, it needs to have the right value, the right saturation, the right importance, and the right message. Colors are an important part of the communication of the artwork. Colors are a powerful tool. They can suggest emotions, or they can tell you instantly a lot of the picture, the environment, the lights, or they can tell you what are the important parts of the illustration. The illumination, the lights, and the shadows are also an important part of the composition of an artwork. The lights and the shadows are really important to determine the forms of the objects that we are trying to describe in our illustration. They help us immediately to understand the three-dimensional forms of our subjects. To being able to see an object, we need a light source that illuminates it. The light is coming from a specific direction. This means that the part of our object that is facing the light source is more illuminated than the other side. This creates lights and shadows on the object. The light can be divided in center light, which is the brighter part, facing directly the light source, and in halftones, which are the parts of the object that receive less light, so they are darker than the center light. The shadow on the object is called form shadow, being its own shadow on itself. The form shadow is made of the core shadow and the reflected light, which is the light that bounces off another object and hits the first one where the light cannot reach it directly, in its shadow. The reflected light is darker than the halftones, but it makes the shadow, or a part of it, brighter. The core shadow is a part of the form shadow that is still dark, even if there is a reflected light on the object. The edge between light and shadow on the object is called the terminator. The shadow of the first object on the second one is called cast shadow. Even the cast shadow is affected of the reflected light, and there can also be a part that remains dark, where the two objects touches each other. This part is called occlusion shadow. Important to consider is that there are a lot of different types of illuminations, suggesting different emotions or messages. If we decide to do an illustration set in a dark room lit only by a candle, the result will be a completely different feeling of that of an illustration set in a large outdoor environment with a bright sunlight illumination. If the light sources change, the highlights and the shadows change as well. Some light sources like light bulbs, fire, candles, and so on are called point lights. The light coming from a point light spreads in all directions. Some artificial light sources like lamps or headlights are more directional lights, but even in this case the light spreads like a cone. In geometrical drawing there exists a so-called infinite light, where the light follows exclusively one direction. All light particles flow in parallel lines. In nature there is not really any such thing as infinite light, but in art it is used mainly to represent sunlight, as the sun is just too big and too far away from Earth to make us see any difference in the light direction. There can also be hard lights or soft lights, changing the sharpness of the shadow's edge. The light can be colored, influencing the color palette of the image. Usually professional artists decide in every drawing what light sources to use, even if they are not going to include it in the composition. Even if we cannot see it, usually the artist has thought very well about what generates the light in the drawing, with what intensity, and especially and most important of all, from which direction it comes. Knowing the direction of the light allows us to create all shadows in a believable way, which is important because it might feel unrealistic if on one object the shadow is on one side and on another object the shadow is facing another direction. Drawing the lights and the shadows in an illustration can be really technical, almost math. But even here there can be a lot of exceptions. A lot of artists tend to bend the rules to create a better illustration. They change the shadows or the highlights to make the form better visible, or simply because they like it more in their own way. In a lot of cases, when we do just little changes, it is very difficult to tell that they are not realistic. In other situations, of course, if we create non-realistic illustrations, it doesn't even really matter anymore. Let's take, for example, the drawing that I did in the last video. The forms might be not so clear to understand at the first look. If I would draw the shadows on this house, I would not draw them in a realistic way. I would not use a light source, so I wouldn't have the light that comes from one direction. What I would do is drawing the shadow along the edges to make come out the elements that are closer to the viewer. This kind of shadow is called ambient occlusion, yet it is not a kind of illumination that exists in the real world. I think it is important to be able to ignore the rules sometimes. In the end, when we create art, we are the creators of our world and we can decide what's happening and what's not. It all depends on what we want. If we have fun drawing the things in our own way, that's art as well. If we want to explore the realism and study the lights and the shadows, the colors and the perspective, it will probably be an important part of your artistic path.